The buyer representation agreement. Who needs to sign one? When does it need to be signed and why? Today I'll be answering all of these questions. So let's get started. This form is a contract between a buyer and a real estate company that gives the real estate company permission to act on the buyer's behalf in the purchase of a property. Assuming the buyer is a client of the real estate company, the Real Estate Council of Ontario REBA Code of Ethics requires that salespeople have a written buyer representation agreement presented for signature prior to an offer being presented on behalf of the buyer. The section at the top identifies the parties involved in the agreement and sets the time frame for which the contract is valid. The REBA Code of Ethics requires the buyer's initials on this form if the agreement is to extend beyond 6 months. This next section is the area which the buyer and the brokerage agree that the buyer is interested in buying a property. The buyer is warranting that the buyer has not entered into any buyer representation agreement with another brokerage. Definitions and interpretations. This section of the form defines the terms that follow in the document, including seller, buyer, purchase, etc. Section 2, Commission. This section of the agreement sets out the structure for the commission to be paid to the real estate company. It states that the buyer agrees to pay a commission to the real estate company, the detail of which is set out in this section. The real estate company is entitled to commission when the buyer enters into an agreement to buy or lease a property. The buyer agrees the commission may come from a listing brokerage or by the seller. If it turns out that there isn't enough, the buyer will make up the difference. Section 3, Representation. This paragraph confirms that the real estate company and the salesperson have explained the different types of agency and other relationships that may occur in a real estate transaction. Section 4, Referral of Properties. The buyer is committing to work with the brokerage and agrees to communicate to the brokerage any interest in any property that comes to the buyer's attention. The buyer will be responsible to pay commission to the brokerage if the buyer purchases a property during the term of the buyer representation agreement or the holdover period. Section 5, Indemnification. The buyer acknowledges that the salesperson and the brokerage are not qualified to determine the physical condition of the property, and the buyer agrees that the brokerage will not be liable for any defects. Section 6, Finder's Fee. This clause provides consent in the event the brokerage or the salesperson receives a finder's fee or other reward as part of the transaction. This fee may come from a mortgage company. It should be noted that specific consent will be required when it actually happens. Section 7, Consumer Reports. The buyer acknowledges that credit checks and personal information may be referred to in the process of purchasing a property. Section 8, Use and Distribution of Information. The following section gives salespeople the right under the privacy legislation to use personal information provided to them by the buyer in order to assist in making the transaction happen. It also assures the buyer that this information will not be distributed to third parties, i.e., pool or moving companies. Section 9, Conflict or Discrepancy. If something is added to the agreement, usually in a schedule, then the provisions that were added override the text or preset provisions in the form. Section 10, Successors and Assigns. In the event one of the parties dies before closing, their heirs and executors are bound by the agreement. Section 11, Electronic Communication. This agreement, if necessary, may be sent via electronic means and still be binding on all parties. Section 12, Electronic Signatures. This clause provides consent if the parties use electronic signatures with respect to this agreement. Section 13, Schedules. If additional terms or a specific form or document is added to the form, then it is referred to here. The next section states that the company representing the buyer will assist the buyer in locating a property with a general description as indicated above and endeavor to obtain the acceptance of an offer for the buyer. The next section is where the salesperson signs on behalf of the brokerage. And then the next section is where the buyer acknowledges having read and understood the terms of the buyer representation agreement. The declaration of insurance is signed by the salesperson stating that they carry insurance as required by the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act, also known as REBA.